My name is Paul Rudensky, and I am the Assistant Director of Education here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. And I am pleased to welcome all of you here for your in-service on end-of-life issues for Holocaust survivors. Anyway, on behalf of the Museum of Jewish Heritage, I'm delighted to have all of you here. And we are grateful, the museum, but also I think as the Jewish community, we're grateful for all the great work that you do with the elderly and especially with the Holocaust survivors. One thing I have found in working with Holocaust survivors is that they're an extraordinarily resourceful group, an extraordinarily dedicated group, and while that might make them difficult to work with, at the same time they're extraordinarily inspiring. And I think all of you who have the opportunity to work with Holocaust survivors will feel that.
I want to thank everyone for joining us at this important event. My name is Eleanor Canning. I'm the Senior Vice President of the Hospice and Palliative Care Program at MJHS, Hospice and Palliative Care, and I'm a nurse by background. The book I could find was Florence Nightingale's Notes on Nursing. Is anybody in the room from a nursing background have a copy of this? Right. So as I looked through it and I said, what can I communicate to this group about why we're all here today? And my message is, and the message from Florence Nightingale and I guess all of those folks that were in our nursing class, is meet the patient where they are. They have traveled a road you're only beginning to learn about. Understanding their past is not enough if you don't feel it viscerally. And if you don't feel it viscerally, then you must feel it intellectually. And I'm speaking to the nurses and the other clinicians in the group. Act on what they tell you is important to them, because that's really where they want to begin whatever journey that they're at right now. And be non-judgmental. It really doesn't matter what your opinion is. It just matters what their opinion is, and how do you bring your gifts as a clinician to the table to meet the patient and family where they are.
Right. Welcome, everybody. I'm so thrilled to be here. I'm so thrilled that all of you are here today. Thank you for coming to this educational program. Our goals for today will be to educate professionals on the impact of the trauma on Holocaust survivors as they confront end of life, the transmission of that trauma to the second generation Holocaust survivors, and how it presents in the caregiving process. We also want to raise awareness and cognizance in professionals of their reactions to manifestations of trauma and difficult behaviors in patients and families. We consider it a moral obligation to ensure that all professionals supporting the needs of survivors of the Holocaust or any other significant trauma have the appropriate tools to deliver care that is informed and sensitive to the personal histories of patients and their families. We have a shared responsibility to provide a peaceful passage to a population that has seen more than its share of pain and suffering.
I came to America in 46, excuse me. I was liberated in 45 and came here in 46. I was picked up from the ship by my mother's cousin's husband. And on the way to the house, to where they lived, he said to me, "Do not talk about anything. You will upset Tante," was his wife, "and you'll upset the children. So don't say anything. I don't want to know. I have an idea how you survived." And he looked at me, and I said, "But how can I not tell Tante when I saw her mother and sister killed? Don't you think she would want to know what happened to them?" "No, you are not allowed to speak." Fast forward, I'm working, and I want to say something to the people that I'm working with. And each time I started to say something, I was greeted with the same message. Forget everything. Start a new life. You're in America. You don't have to talk about it. You should just forget it. Forget what I saw? Don't they understand? And on Yom Kippur, 1942, my father, Yehoshua ben Aaron, Oliver Shoreham, was hanged. My brother had to cut him down, dig a ditch. His body was thrown into the ditch. And then my brother was shot and thrown into the same ditch. When I heard that story, I said, I will never, never bring children into this world. I would not expose them to the kind of suffering that I have. And I believed it for a long time until my husband convinced me that maybe if we have children, maybe we can make it a better world altogether. Tikkun Olam. That's the last time I heard my brother's voice or saw my brother Benjamin. I'm still looking for him. I never stopped. I thought maybe that man made a mistake. I'm still looking. Wherever I go, I still look at names. I'll never stop. A shot rang out. And my grandmother was killed with a bullet in her head, right here. And then he turned around and shot grandfather in his heart. And they pulled out some of the Jewish boys who had their bris, and so obviously they were very recognizable. And in front of all of us, they were shot. Do you forget that ever? I was told to forget. You can't forget that. Because maybe I'm next to be shot. Because I identified with them. And then one day I was sent on an errand to town to pick up an ancient clock that had been repaired. And I was going to bring it back. And as I was coming back, three soldiers followed me. And I was attacked. And I was gang raped. I dug a hole in the soil which was moist and soft. And I put my face, my whole head into the hole. I didn't want to live anymore. I howled like an animal. And when I couldn't howl anymore, I stopped and I buried God. The God of my childhood, the God that I prayed to every day, left me on the ground in my own blood. The will to live is strong. I would have longed to die because I couldn't get lower. I hit rock bottom. But the birds were singing, the flowers were in bloom. It was, the world was good. The sun was shining. The animals needed to be milked, needed to be taken care of. Life goes on a farm. And I believe that it was this farm work, this life, this sunshine, the fact that there are trees blooming, there are trees, there were butterflies. What I left behind was nothing but death, the smell of death. And what I found on the farm, when I hit rock bottom, this is what I found, and this is what helped me. You will be faced, and you are faced, with people of my own background, probably. Some much worse than mine. I don't know whether they will have the strength to open up to you in the last days of their life. I want to say, and I speak in many places, I just spoke in a Catholic school. I want to say, Papa, I'm doing what you wanted me to do. Papa, can you hear me? Because I am doing what he said. by your listening, by your being here, I feel that I've fulfilled his prophecy. I don't know. I knew what was right, and I did, no matter whatever the Holocaust did to me, it did not take away what I learned as a child. On the contrary, it helped me. I'm reaching out to you because you are helping me. By listening, you're helping me. And I thank you.
As you can imagine, having listened to Ruth, experiences such as hers color the rest of one's life and certainly color the way that one experiences the difficult phase of aging and what comes with it. The way in which we grow old and experience this process, our health and functional ability all depend not only on our genetic makeup, but also on what we have done during our lives, what sort of thing we have encountered in the course of our lifetime, on how and where we have lived our lives. When people are exposed to traumatic events, we actually have come to realize over the last few decades it was not something that we assumed, or that the professions of mental health, psychiatry, psychology, and the rest of them acknowledged until 1980 with the introduction of PTSD into DSM. The professions did not know that being exposed to terrible things such as what Ruth talked about has a lasting impact on people, is because what we believe as mental health professionals, as physicians, what we believe to be the way things are, influences tremendously what we actually allow us to see in the patients and recognize in the patients. So over those few last decades, it has become finally clear that when people experience shocking, terrible events, it does lead to significant and long-lasting physical and psychological damage. So what is trauma? How do we understand trauma now? Now we understand trauma as the 3 E's, if you like. It's an event that, or a set of circumstances, because it doesn't have to be a one-time event. It can be an ongoing set of circumstances, such as the Holocaust, such as certain people living in certain very terrible environments today. It's an event or a series of circumstances that is experienced by the person as threatening or harmful. That's the second E. So some people will be in the same situation and they will experience it as less harmful and horrific than somebody else. It's very individual, and that is something that they experience as having lasting effects on their well-being. That's the SAMHSA definition today, substance abuse and mental health. I just want to remind you that post-traumatic stress disorder, that we all are much more familiar with in speaking about trauma survivors, is only one response, one type of response. There are other post-traumatic responses, primarily depression and anxiety. And we have to be very aware of it, that when we meet people with post-traumatic reactions, they might not have the classic ones of PTSD. When the disorder is caused by intentional, malignant intent from one person or one group of people to other people, the traumatic impact of it is much, much more severe than the traumatic impact of a disaster or an accident or something like that. Why are you likely to meet Holocaust survivors and other trauma survivors as healthcare providers? Because post-traumatic stress reactions, including PTSD, are very strongly associated with a lot of health issues. Health is very much badly, negatively impacted by trauma, and therefore, when people age, they are likely to have a lot more problems. PTSD is also at a very high risk for dementia and for cognitive impairment. That's another reason why you are likely to find in nursing homes and in all kinds of facilities like that, a higher percent of people who are actually trauma survivors than not, because we don't know what exactly is the nature of the relationship. It's probably bidirectional. Namely, PTSD causes death of brain cells and shrinking of the brain. That's one hypothesis, as seen by the fact that the postmortem brains of people that we know were victims of trauma are smaller than the brains of other people. So either that or that dementia disinhibits the capacity to suppress post-traumatic reactions. In any case, because of dementia and cognitive impairment, these people will end up more likely in our care and in nursing homes and in places that are medical settings, and we will come to meet them. Now, it might be a very difficult experience for us to actually work with someone who has to deal and reckon with the finality of their time, with the fact that they can not make peace with their path, because they didn't make choices. Choices were made for them to a great extent, and with the fact that we cannot really do much about it. We can't change it, we can't heal, we can't help. And that can make us be a lot less empathetic to survivors at the end of their lives. When older people come to you who are in their 70s or 80s, they themselves often, when they're depressed all of a sudden, or very anxious all of a sudden, they themselves don't establish the connection necessarily to the trauma that happened 65 years ago. And most important for us to remember is that it's often disguised under a lot of somatic pains and complaints and medical conditions, which are real, which are also sometimes psychogenic, and a lot of medication side effects. So the whole mixture makes it very hard sometimes to understand, why do we think that we're likely to see more PTSD in older age? Actually, because there are three reasons why we think it's more likely to surface in old age. First of all, there is a decrease in mental and physical resilience. People sometimes are weaker, they feel more helpless, they feel less capable of doing things, and that sort of allows suppressed memories or memories that were warded off to come much more to the fore. Decrease in financial resources, social resources, new losses, people lose friends, people lose relatives, leaves people really with much less support, and that's very, very much another reason to feel the helplessness and the renewed mourning for previous losses. They have less support, they're more likely to get more depressed and anxious. And the interaction with normative processes of aging. Here we go, that normative processes of aging are likely to actually kick up post-traumatic reactions for people who have had trauma, severe trauma, in earlier times. Why? Because we know that as we age, as we kind of reach a certain point in life, for some of us it's kind of 50, 55 and on, we begin to do more reminiscing, more life review, more meaning making. How did we live? What were our choices? How do we make peace with these choices? All of that kind of stuff. But it's a lot more difficult for trauma survivors to make peace with a life and with choices and with losses that they had so little control over and that were so brutally imposed upon them. It's very different than having to make peace with the fact that, my first marriage didn't work out, I had a divorce, it was very difficult, but then I met my second husband and life was much better. It's not the same as someone who has to say, I lost my family, my parents were brutally murdered, my brother disappeared under brutal conditions, but I ended up in this wonderful country, and I met my husband, and I had wonderful children. Many of them were told specifically, don't think about it, forget it, don't talk about it. They themselves had to push it aside in order to get up in the morning and behave in the world with people around them as if they don't know what people are capable of, as if they don't know how bad things can be, and to sort of rejoin the world as if everything is normal. They also had to push a lot aside. When they're diagnosed, physicians and mental health professionals sometimes think, well, what can you do? It makes sense. The person is 90 or 87. They lost their spouse. Their kids live in Colorado. Their friends all died. Of course they're depressed and there's nothing to be done. What can we do? The fact of the matter is to be stressed to you that depression and anxiety in older age are not normal, no matter what happens in the life of the person, and can be treated. Dehumanization is endemic in medical practice. It is. I've worked in hospitals for many years, and I've seen it firsthand. It is truly endemic in medical practice, and it does not result from bad intentions or lack of good intentions. So first of all, what is dehumanization? So the essence of dehumanization is any time when we somehow find ourselves denying the essence of what is to be human, what is to have a human mind to another person. That's really the essence. So as soon as we look at somebody and we think their mind is not exactly fully functional, we are at a risk of dehumanizing them. This is very, very important because there is a very strong and immediate relationship between dehumanization and empathy. As soon as we dehumanize somebody and see them as not quite human, we have a justification to treat them much worse than we maybe would have if we saw them as equally as human as us. The functional ones are the fact that procedures have become very mechanized so that there is much less contact between the physician and the patient. Now, it's not only the gloves and the masks and the goggles and the whatnot, it's the fact that most procedures or many procedures are done totally, by a machine, completely away from the patient. Yes, so that's one cause. Another one is empathy reduction and moral disengagement, two different ones. Empathy reduction to a necessary degree is what people have to do when their job is such that day in and day out they have to deal with people who are in great pain. They have to even cause them some pain in order to treat them, right? We have to stick needles, you have to do all kinds of things. It hurts. You can't be too queasy and too empathetic in that way, or you won't be able to do your job well. And some patients are going to die, especially in palliative care, and all of those demands of and you have to give bad news to people. All of those things require that if you are going to function well, you have to reduce your empathy a little bit, right? When it was one doctor, one patient, it's a different level of moral commitment between the two than when it's a huge team and the team changes all the time. There's a very different sense of moral disengagement. So these are things that are hard to change because that's the way modern medicine operates now. We just have to be aware of it, and if we're aware of it, then maybe we can still find little ways to modify it and minimize it. All medical providers wear a uniform, patients wear a uniform, individual characteristics are sort of erased. Some of it is functional. The main cause of dehumanization of other people or perceiving somebody else in a way that will dehumanize that person in my eyes is when I don't attribute to them a mind that is as functional as mine. Now, patients, by the nature of the fact that they're patients, are often impaired, either because of the illness or the fever or the whatever. Certainly if they are cognitively impaired on a more long-term basis because of deterioration, cognitive deterioration, then they're very much at risk to be dehumanized by us. So what does it mean if somebody is all of a sudden, old and crinkled and has no hair where we have hair, but does have maybe hair where we don't really want to have hair, and moles and all kinds of other unattractive features that age and illness can cause, and all kinds of things like that that make the person, look like, hey, look at Yoda, for example, right? That's somebody who's kind of human, but not so similar to the humanoid prototype anymore. And that can become very off-putting. That can become very, that's not quite human. Now let's be honest, especially those of us who work with people who are severely ill, or those of us who work with people who are dying because of severe illness, or because those of us who are working with those who are very old. We meet a lot of patients who are not quite like the attractive humanoid prototype. Ethnic dissimilarity. We live now in a very varied culture, and we can meet a patient who is very dissimilar from us. And that, as I will expand upon in a minute, is another great source of danger for dehumanizing the other, because they just look so different from our clan or from our family. Our brain tends to maybe dehumanize certain others who are different from us. And that is not at all related to how consciously egalitarian, democratic, and well-intentioned we are. In fact, if we really are democratic and egalitarian, and we really do want to provide people the best care, regardless of who they are, then what we have to do is recognize our brain's natural tendency to do that and find ways to counter it. We have an innate, automatic tendency to categorize those who are like us as more human, and those that are less like us as less human. Humanoid prototype, when they look less like our clan people, we might, and they look less like they have a functional mind, we tend to attribute less humanity to them. That if I show you pictures or ask you to think about people with features that lead to dehumanization, namely people whose mind is clearly not functioning well, they don't look like the humanoid prototype, they don't look like your clan members, and all of those things that I mentioned, they actually move to be processed in the part of the brain that processes also non-human objects. So really, the brain actually does it in a different place. The good thing about it is that we have certain tricks that we can play, which I'll tell you about, with our own self to regulate our reaction. We can move the processing of that person back to the medial prefrontal cortex, where only humans are processed. When somebody evokes in us the response of disgust for whatever reason, they move in our brain to the area that processes not quite human objects. And think about it honestly, how many of us in the encounter with very sick people, very old people, people who maybe don't smell so good, don't look so good, how many of us will have the natural response of disgust? And we have to be aware of it. We have to not push it aside. We have to register it and then do what we need to do specifically in order to move it back to the area that deals with humans and does not dehumanize. Why are we talking about this in conjunction with survivors of the Holocaust? is because trauma victims in general are at a much higher risk even than other elderly patients or other patients for distancing and dehumanization by their care providers. Why? Because first of all, when we encounter horror stories, such as some of the stories that survivors tell us, it confronts us with such degree of human sadism and such horrific stories and horrific images that the disgust comes up in us, and the disgust is misplaced on the person that told us about it rather than on the people who did it to them. This is the immediate stimulus, if you like, that caused it in us, and the disgust becomes displaced or misplaced on the victim. We might feel also a great sense of need to distance ourselves from this person. We don't want to hear it. We don't know how to deal with our reactions to them. And in some ways, sometimes it's almost, and sometimes not almost, blaming the victim for what happened to them. Maybe, and sometimes it's really quite in the open. You know, if the Jews weren't so, I don't know what, then the local population wouldn't have been so mean to them or so hateful to them, or maybe, you know, things like that. So both disgust and sometimes overly paternalistic attitudes towards the patient are a way of distancing. So as soon as you find yourself sort of compelled to treat somebody with sorry, I don't mean to make you jump, but something like, oh, hi Daisy, how are you today? And kind of barely actually looking at the person as a person, that is the kind of paternalistic behavior that actually is very distancing. You're actually trying to not be with that person. Trauma survivor patients can actually be very difficult patients. They may exhibit very difficult behaviors that are associated with PTSD, and their behaviors can actually alienate us. They can be belligerent, they can be aggressive, they can be very fearful of us if they're cognitively impaired. A lot of fear can come up. 5 minutes. To remind you, especially for people who are exposed to severe trauma as children, we now see very specifically that there is a real impact, a lasting impact on their capacity to control and contain their stress responses, and there are real changes in the brain. So it's not just a character flaw, it's really something that trauma does to people. And we see an inordinate investment of the children in protecting their parents, and that has been there from the time that they know their name. It is not something that has to do with an informational knowledge about the Holocaust. It is something that is instilled on an affective, emotional level way before children understand about the Holocaust. They understand not to trigger their parents. They understand that their parents went through something terrible. They understand not to upset them, not to worry them, not to do this, not to do that. And as a result, many of the children of survivors have, throughout their lives, put their parents' needs ahead of their own in many, many ways, trying not to trigger the parent into unpleasant states of worry or anxiety or any other negative emotion, and really trying to protect them. And now when you're seeing them as the parent is sick and dying or suffering, when they become very difficult with you because they don't think you do a good enough job or they think that you don't care enough, it's sometimes simply because of their own difficulty with this inevitable situation where they finally cannot protect the parent and they cannot make the parent feel better. And so their desperation and their lifelong investment in it, their lifelong quest to protect their parents is failing. And that is what you're seeing. And if you understand it, then you might be a little bit more tolerant of it and a little bit more compassionate and sort of meet them at that place. Also, there are those children who rebelled against it and who couldn't do that and who went the other way. And then you have very, very difficult sibling relationships. Or you have the sibling who sacrificed themselves, didn't go to college far away, stayed at home, married the right person that the parents wanted, sacrificed a lot of their own wishes to satisfy the parents' needs. And then you have the sibling who went to live in California and did whatever they wanted and didn't want to come home to visit frequently enough, or various variations on that theme. And then there's a lot of issues between the siblings. Or you have siblings who both want to protect the parents very, very much, but have very different ideas about it. One is religious and feels that everything needs to be done to keep the parents alive as long as possible, no matter what. The other one is not religious and loves the parent, and from their perspective, palliative care and not taking extreme measures is actually the right way to love and protect the parent. And you get very intense conflicts and very difficult relationships, really in many ways because of the intensity of the need behind it in the different ways to protect a parent that has been perceived as someone who has suffered so much already before, and each child is trying to do it in their own way. This bias can actually be reversed, and we see it reversed in the brain even. So when we use neuroaffective science to look at it, we can see the processing of the disgusting or dehumanized person move back into the right place. And some of those things that are important in that is, first of all, we have to understand what our own baggage with regards to trauma is. And I won't get more into that, but that is very important. We have to understand what are we doing with our own pain, and that will help us sort of do a little bit of soul searching as to how we deal with other people's pain. Do we distance it? Do we over-identify with it? Are we imposing our opinions and so forth? As for de-individuation, do the opposite, especially when people are not exactly cognitively fully there. Bring as much information about their lives, their role, who they were, what they liked into the room. That is another thing that's very important for us, to include pictures not only of the patient, and preferably of the patient when they were young and at their prime, reminding us that they were like us, that they had a life like us, that they were active, especially pictures of the patient in interaction with somebody else that cares about them and in mid-motion. That really sort of brings it to life. Also, very simple thing and very powerful thing. Just thinking about the other person's mind. Even if the person themselves is out and has no functioning mind anymore, if we ourselves make ourselves think about their mind, it moves the processing of that patient back into the human social cognitions. And it's enough to think, I wonder if she liked broccoli or not. As soon as we think about their mind, they go back to being processed as people.
And I was actually asked to bring to you people a message of hope. It's easy. You know what the message is? I'm here. After the Holocaust and after many years after that, I went to Israel. And we were encouraged to actually change our personality, change our names, and to become different people. Secondly, I decided not to carry the title of a survivor. I decided to carry a title of a witness. And I believe that all of the people that survived the Holocaust are really witnesses of the most unspeakable tragedy that happened in our lifetime. When I arrived there, I was 5 years old, and no parents, and knowing no one. All I saw is cattle cars open and waiting for the human cargo to be shipped to gas chambers. I was in Umschlagplatz in a horrible situation, alone, under a bench, hiding, because my brain was so conditioned to hiding through all these years. I knew that this is the only way that you can live, is you hide. I survived because of my imagination, and person, in certain circumstances, create their own reality, which I happened to do. I created the reality of a fairy tale. I created the reality that the bad witch is going to die and a prince is going to save my life. And that's how I live from day to day. Well, I got married. I have children. They're grown. I have grandchildren. At that one Yom Kippur day, I was lighting the memory candles and started crying. You cannot close those memories forever. If you don't open the black box, you will never be free, never. And my children obviously understood that very well. And from that point, we started going public, as I say. Started talking about it, went to all the schools of my grandchildren. I spoke in a lot of places. I spoke in churches all over. And that kind of gave me a relief from all this trauma that they went through. We have to respect the people that went through this Holocaust. We have to respect that, because these people gave us our country. These people gave us our life, and they deserve all the praise and all the kavod that we can give them.
I was wondering if you've identified any particular needs among second-generation patients, whether in hospice or in other settings, and how you address those needs.
I will admit that I am not averse to any kind of manipulation if sometimes it might succeed. So for example, I will say to people who complain about pain, yes, all kinds of pain syndromes, which are first of all very common in people who are older, certainly if they are ill, right, like your patient. If they complain to me about pain, I will say, Cymbalta is very good for treating pain. Neurontin 2 for pain and for numbness. I will say, which is the truth, it is very good for it. It also happens to be an antidepressant.